Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, the #1 professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. The link for membership is in the show notes.
Hi there, my name is Corey Clements. I'm the SLP Nerdcast Resource Specialist. It's my job to help you link research and practice. I seek out resources that are rooted in evidence and bring them to your fingertips. You can head on over to our resource library and check out all the available resources we already have for you. You can find me at resources@slpnerdcast.com. I can't wait to help you link research and practice.
This episode is a bit different than our typical episode. This episode is part of a conference called SLP Linked. The focus and purpose of SLP Linked is to connect research directly with practice. Each session as part of this conference will discuss what research looks like in our therapy rooms. Our goal is to bring you this content at least once every year to help you bring research into your therapy spaces and bring you therapy activities and ideas from the researchers themselves. Stay tuned for more information about the conference, but for now, on to the episode. Welcome, everyone, to SLP Nerdcast. This episode is part of our first annual event called SLP Linked. SLP Linked is an online conference that focuses specifically on connecting research with practice. And this session is focused on speech sound disorders. Specifically, we are going to be looking at what research on speech sound disorders might look like in practice. And today we have the great pleasure of welcoming our expert guest and researcher, Dr. Carlos Arizari Perez. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you're here to discuss speech sound disorders research and what it might look like in practice. But before we get started, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. I'm going into my 5th year here at the University of Mexico at the time of this recording. I did my PhD work at the University of Texas at Austin, and upon graduating, received a position here at UNM, where I teach a variety of courses and also am the PI for the Bilingual Speech and Language Lab. In the Bilingual Speech and Language Lab, we research specifically intervention practices to address the needs of bilingual children, in our case, Spanish-English bilingual children that have speech sound disorders.
Wonderful. I know very little about speech sound disorders. I have learned a little bit about working with bilingual and multilingual, multicultural learners through this podcast project, but I'm very excited to learn more from you today. Before we get started, I do need to read our learning objectives and disclosures, so I will get through that as quickly as I can. Learning objective number 1, describe a piece of research related to speech sound disorders intervention. Learning objective number 2, describe 3 research-informed therapy activities that exemplify research in practice. Disclosures, Carlos's financial disclosures. Carlos has received funding from the Advancing Academic Research Careers Grant. Carlos's non-financial disclosures, Carlos is a member of ASHA. Kate, that's me, my financial disclosures. I am the owner and founder of Grandbois Therapy and Consulting LLC and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy. Boring stuff behind us. Let's get into all the nerdy stuff. I would love to hear about a piece of research that you've participated in or that you feel has really important clinical takeaways. I wonder if you could start by just telling us maybe the name of the article, and for everybody listening, the references will be in the show notes, but tell us a little bit about just the title of the article and where we could find it, and then maybe what research question drove you to study this.
Yeah, sure. So I think the article that I would love to talk about is one that I'm particularly proud of, personally proud of, and it's a recent one that was just published in LSHSS, there's ASHA Journal, Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in Schools, and it's titled The Complexity Approach to Promoting Within and Cross-Language Generalization in Bilingual Children with Phonological Delays. It's an article that I wrote with my co-authors, Dr. Leah Fabiano-Smith and my colleague, Andrea Martinez-Fisher. And we completed this project during COVID, actually. So I'm partially proud of it because we completed it during COVID. We put together the IRB, got everything in place, and then things shut down. And I wasn't sure that this was going to happen, and we were able to pull it off. And so first, I'm really proud of it for that reason. So what was prompting this particular article was two pieces. One, we know that bilingual children with speech sound disorders need intervention in both languages. If you're going to have a speech sound disorder, in particular phonological delay, it's going to surface in both languages, and both languages need to be addressed. We also know that simultaneously in our field, there is a shortage of bilingual practitioners. And so how do we do that? How do we support both languages, or how can we, even when maybe we don't speak the other language? The other piece is that we know that for children with phonological delays, there's a large body of research that choosing complex targets can really support generalization. However, we have very little intervention research for bilingual children with phonological delays, with speech sound disorders. And I wanted to explore or answer that question. How do we apply the complexity approach with bilingual children? And if you choose sounds that are shared across languages, that we can see generalization across those languages. So let's take a sound like S in English. We know that sound exists in Spanish as well. If we can work in English we would expect to see some generalization to Spanish, and vice versa. If you do that in Spanish, you would expect to see it in English. So that is that cross-linguistic generalization piece. We also know that complex targets facilitate generalization because of a variety of principles, linguistic principles, that say that if something is more complex, that the simpler, maybe earlier developing item with more language, that knowledge will generalize to it. It's simpler. In really, really kind of simple terms, if you can produce the sounds in ol, as in like flag, then you're very likely to be able to produce like lake or fire or something. There's a good rationale to say, okay, let's take fool, like a complex target, a complex cluster, and choose that as our target, because it's going to be more efficient in some sense. If we can get the child to be accurate at that sound, then those other ones come into place. And a lot of times one of them will be there, but the other one won't. So the team's kind of thought was, let's combine those two principles. Let's take complex shared sounds and treat in one language and look for generalization, because we should be able to see even more generalization in those cases. We should be able to see that cross-linguistic generalization. We should be able to see that within language generalization too. And if we're thinking about being efficient, if we're thinking about addressing all the needs of a bilingual child, then we got to be kind of creative. We got to be thinking about these strategies in this way. And I wanted to test that to see if it worked, if it was true.
I think that really sets the stage for not only the need for why we needed this evidence, why you needed to ask this question, but also the importance, particularly if the majority of our field are not bilingual speakers. So I wonder if you could tell us what your next step was. So what did you do? What steps did you take to answer this question?
Once we have this idea, we've got to get it approved and make sure that we are doing things in ethical ways. As a side note, we also wanted to make sure that we did it in culturally responsive ways. And so our first step, once we had our research plan, once it was approved, was of course to recruit. And we brought in a lot of referrals and we assessed everyone. And so we found bilingual children that had phonological delays and met our inclusionary criteria. And from that point, everything starts with a solid assessment. You need a solid assessment because you need to really understand the profile of the child, what their needs are, to be able to choose appropriate goals. So I want to highlight that piece, because if you don't do a thorough comprehensive assessment, then you're going to end up doing more work down the road. So once we had appropriately identified these children, then this is where the intervention piece came in. And thankfully, we had some resources that we could rely on. So one of the things that for me is really important when I'm doing an intervention study, and I've done a couple now that have been published, is I always want it to be something that's accessible to clinicians. The assessments that we use, in the article, you'll see they're ones that most clinicians will have, like the GIFTA, the First Test of Articulation, the BESA. So then we wanted to choose our targets. And for choosing our targets, there are free protocols that are out there for clinicians to choose complex targets. The one that we used was the Phonological Assessment and Treatment Target Selection Forms. It's called the PAT. They're developed by Barlow and colleagues and completely free. You can download them, and they just systematically walk you through how to choose a complex target by first identifying the phonemic inventory, identifying which sounds are stimulable versus not stimulable. So which sounds are separating singletons from clusters, being able to choose clusters that are closer or farther apart in sonority distance. And we completed one for the English, and we completed one for Spanish. Okay, those first initial steps were what I would recommend any clinician do who wants to choose a complex target. The piece that we differed on in our study, which is the novel piece, is that these protocols are language specific, right? There's one in English, there's one in Spanish. And of course, because we're looking at generalization and we are wanting to choose these shared sounds, we needed to look at them together in a sense. And so we needed to find the pieces that overlapped. And what we did was we chose our English clusters. We wanted to choose consonant clusters because those are complex targets. And we chose our Spanish consonant clusters. And then we saw which ones overlapped. And those were the consonant clusters that we chose. And they ended up being like the one that kind of emerged for everyone was the FL, because that exists in both Spanish and English. And so it isn't that you don't need to necessarily work in Spanish or work in just English, but if you start with a shared sound, you're going to address both at once, right? You're going to be a bit more efficient. We started with the ones that were complex clusters, and then we did therapy. We did our intervention, and I have to give a lot of credit to my team, my graduate students that did the actual intervention, and my colleague Andrea who supervised it, and then we looked for our outcomes.
And what did you find? Now I need to know. That's like that's the biggest part, right? So what were the findings of this research?
Yeah, so our findings were really positive. So in this article, we presented a full cycle for one of the children because we had the most data for that particular one. And what we saw was that when we did target, in this case, it was in Spanish. So we targeted FL in Spanish, that we saw generalization to other consonant clusters in Spanish, and then also to those same consonant clusters in English. And so that was really exciting findings. In a perfect world, we would have loved to reversed it and done English and then in Spanish. There's already been some work though that has kind of shown, as you might guess, like in English that you get some of this. And so we also wanted to do something a little bit different and work in Spanish, the stronger language of this particular child. And yeah, we saw that like global generalization that we were hoping for.
So, to say this back to you as someone who knows very, very little about this, essentially, the findings of your research suggest that this complex target approach, when done in a child's primary language, and in the case of your study, it was Spanish,
Right.
there is successful generalization across languages, as well as generalization to less complex phonetic structures. Is that accurate?
If that target is also shared across both languages.
Yes, and that was the critical piece.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start talking about what this piece of research looks like in therapy. So these are really important clinical takeaways, presumably if the majority of our workforce is monolingual. Before we actually talk about the activities and things, what would you say are the most important clinical takeaways from this piece of research?
Yes. Yes, just to kind of echo back what you said, the novel piece that I think, the most novel piece, I should say, is combining those two principles of complexity and shared phonetic overlap. Because there had been plenty of researchers that have shown that complex targets generalize, and we don't have a giant amount, but we have some data to show that shared sounds generalize cross-linguistically. But complex shared sounds was the novel piece for us. And I think that the most important kind of takeaway that I would say is if you have a child with a phonological delay that is bilingual, you want to be thinking already about complex targets. Like evidence-based practice would tell you that is one of the most supported kind of way to choose your targets. These are presumably children that are moderate to kind of severe and in their delays, and they're probably collapsing many sounds into one sound, and there is a lot of knowledge that they don't have in their sound system, and we really want to be thinking about expanding it in different ways and trying to be efficient. If that child is also bilingual, then be thinking about choosing those ones that are also shared across the languages, because we want to address both languages, and that is one way to increase that level of generalization into the other language. Now, if you happen to be bilingual yourself, great, right? You can continue to work in the other language. If you are a monolingual speaker or a bilingual speaker that just doesn't happen to speak that language pair, then this is also one way which you can at least indirectly be supporting the skills in that language, knowing that the child needs both to be a successful communicator.
And just to reiterate something that you mentioned, I know that finding interpreters or working with interpreters is a resource that not many of us have access to, but advocating for that access is also something that is within our right. Okay, so I've done my assessment. I have my list of shared consonant clusters or shared complex phonetic structures across both languages.
Because it doesn't necessarily have to be a cluster.
Right. So what next? What did the therapy look like in your lab?
So once we identified our target sounds, we needed to create our stimuli. And we chose, for our particular purposes, 10 words. Clinicians, that's a nice, really easy number for doing accuracy, calculating accuracy. So that's why I chose that. You don't necessarily have to. There's research that shows that it can be less and still be effective. But if you're a clinician, 10 is really easy and neat. Once we chose how many stimuli we wanted, then we needed to actually pick them. 10 in English, 10 in Spanish, and then we picked another 10 or in Spanish that we thought might generalize too, because we want to be monitoring for generalization. So as we're doing intervention, we're constantly probing and we're checking in on whether or not it's working. And this is, I think, the challenge with choosing complex targets that I typically hear from my students. And also when I remember I was a clinician myself, like, you're asking me to choose something that's the hardest thing for them, that they have the least amount of knowledge, that latest, developing, that is not just one but two sounds. And with a child that is already having challenges learning sounds, and I'm supposed to do what? I don't want to make any like illusions that this is necessarily easy. And I do think that every clinician actually has the skill. It doesn't have to be quite as complex, again, no pun intended. Because when you're thinking about clusters, it's typically the case that both sounds aren't in error. The cluster might be in error. They might be reducing it. But typically that earlier developing sound, in the case of FL, the child probably can do. They probably can't do the ul, and they probably can't put it together with a f. And so you do have some knowledge. These children often are coming in with some knowledge that you can work from.
I'm wondering, because I'm thinking about how this might look like specific to an activity, and I'd love to maybe give some examples to everyone listening on what kinds of activities might embody what this looks like, particularly with the complex structure. So you mentioned drills. So doing some sort of drill-based activity might embody what this research finding says. Is there anything that you can share with us about ways that you have seen these kinds of drills be successful in terms of with a board game or with some other kind of activity?
Yeah, so I might clarify it and say drill play and structured play were the primary types of activities that we used with these children, and this child in particular. The drill is here's a flashcard, here's a flashcard, here's a flashcard, say it. And that has its purpose, don't get me wrong. Like, there are times when that can be really beneficial, especially if you're trying to get a lot of trials in, and maybe you're just seeing a child for 10 minutes quickly outside their classroom, for a few days in a row. That might work really well. These children were 5-year-old children. We really want to make therapy fun. They're coming to us sometimes in addition to whatever activities they're doing at school or whatever else they have going on. And so we really try to incorporate play as much as possible into it. And so with drill play, it's the drill, but you're incorporating it into like a board game. And it could be any board game. Like one of them that the children like, some of these old school ones that it's all surprises me, like Candyland. And I think because it's so new, like, whoa, there's so many games out there. And it's as simple as take a turn and let's do 5 trials. And we don't make it dependent on whether or not they get it right or not. We're not trying to put that type of pressure. It's practice opportunities. It's our job as a therapist to support them to be successful. And I always tell my students, get in a few of those, because we're shooting for high numbers of productions. Every single session, we want a minimum of 50 productions.
50.
Ideally, yeah, minimum, yeah. And ideally, I tell them, I want you getting close to 100.
And how I'm just imagining myself, my hypothetical self working in a school, and what resources I might have available to me in terms of the games in the game closet. And I think that drill
Yeah.
play, this concept of drill play, is an activity that a lot of us are really familiar with. You
Yes.
grab your super duper deck and then you grab your Zingo or Candyland or whatever
Classic.
game. I think this combination is really common. I've never heard it called drill play as an activity before, but I really like that. I'm also wondering, though, just in terms of themes, because a lot of school-based classrooms will have go through thematic units.
Hmm.
And how you see the concept of drilling, so this minimum of 50 repetitions, how do you see that getting integrated, let's say, into your pumpkin craft project
Mm.
in when the whole school is, working on Halloween vocabulary and fall themed items? How do you see drilling getting integrated into some of these theme related activities?
So the drilling piece might be challenging, to be honest. I think that in those cases, when I'm thinking about integrating curriculum into the the activities that we are planning with our students in that particular case, that we're thinking about generalization maybe in a different way, and we are probably moving towards more natural activities sometimes, and it might there might be less drill in it, but it isn't that you can't. And so I think one thing that I want to say is you definitely want to have, like for us, we had our probe words, our controlled set that we're checking in and monitoring to see whether or not practice is occurring. Because we have to control so many variables, we also had a very finite set of our treatment words. That doesn't always need to be happening when you are not in a research study. You're not trying to prove or test some theory, so to speak. So it isn't the case that you can't, and you might even start this way when you're creating your stimuli, reach into the curriculum to see if, okay, what FL words might already be present in this particular unit that I can just pull from to begin with. I'm not having to go and recreate something and check in with your classroom teacher. Now, you do have to keep in mind, right, that our intervention might last beyond that unit. But you could start that way. I think that you could also just be incorporating it in as additional activities. And then if it is create a pumpkin, like you said, or something, find those opportunities to reinforce those same targets or those same sounds in different ways. And it just might, if they happen to overlap directly, then sure, you could take a turn putting the top of the pumpkin on, practicing some words, and coloring it in, taking some practicing some more words, and that's totally okay. And especially if there isn't enough overlap, you maybe you do it anyways. But you also like the activity could simply be, I don't know, I'm going to pick something that maybe isn't fall, but maybe you're learning about flags of the world in that case. And that could be the activity. Let's draw a flag. You're already drawing flags in your classroom. And how many opportunities can you come up with the actual word in a craft project that they're already probably like working on in their classroom? There's going to be a lot. It could be as simply as you providing the models throughout the activity and then eliciting of productions in natural ways. Any of that would go. So there isn't one right or wrong way to do it. I think that I have the freedom to be creative too.
What can you tell us about what this treatment might look like in an activity that is closely related to the child's educational experience? So, something that they're experiencing in the classroom, or something literacy related, or something we've already talked about, thematic activities. But if the class is reading a certain book, how can we bring this treatment into the classroom to have it be congruent with your research findings, but also be related to the educational experience?
Yeah, so the child in this particular study and the children that we were working with that had different types of speech sound disorders, they were all kindergarten students. They were all about 5-year age. And in kindergarten, it's typically the case that they are learning this letter sound awareness. They're establishing sight words. And that overlaps with us, with our own goals for as SLPs for them to be able to accurately produce sounds, to increase their intelligibility. And so I think connecting with the teacher in the curriculum and can be very helpful in terms of establishing generalization in different settings, and also just reinforcing in different settings the importance of why they're doing this, and that accurate production practice that we're trying to get them to do. So it could look in different ways depending on the kindergarten classroom, the kindergarten teacher, or whatever. It might be simply pulling the same activities that they're doing in kindergarten and practicing them. And it also might be going into the classroom and being a part of some of the activities that they are doing.
That's really helpful. In our last few minutes, I wonder if you have any additional information for our listeners about other free resources that might be out there or websites that might be helpful. Do you have any additional pieces of information you'd like to leave us with?
I mentioned the PAT, and I think that everything that that Jessica Barlow and her colleagues have done related to that is wonderful. You will see that they also provide a lot of other speech sound resources. And in addition, we provide this, the stimuli that we used. I have another paper that just was published in Clinical Linguistics and Phonetics, in which we link different resources that we pulled stimuli from it in that particular study. And so I think all of those, all of these, they're free resources. These are not things that you have to go really hunt down. You had already mentioned super duper, so I'll say it already. Like in the other study, we use super duper cards. We just changed them. We made it so that they worked, because I'm not always a big fan of some of the super duper stuff. And that particular case, the consonant clusters, we used the minimal pairs approach, and the consonant clusters dropped the earlier developing sound versus the later developing sound. And that's more appropriate for children with atypical phonological delays. And so just know that sometimes you got to tweak things.
Thank you so much for this. This was incredibly helpful. We're so grateful for your time. To anyone listening, all of the references listed in this episode are in the show notes, and we're just so grateful. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And also, if you're listening to this and you have any specific questions or you want to reach out, please do so. I'm happy to communicate via email or whatever that I can do to help support clinicians as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for attending this session of SLP Linked. ASHA CE processing and certificates of completion for SLP Linked are exclusive to SLP Nerdcast members. SLP Nerdcast members also receive access to live events, a downloadable series program, access to 2 bonus courses related to how to adapt these materials across modality, cultural competency, and skill level, as well as access to our speakers, content experts, and researchers through a private discussion board. If you have any questions about becoming an SLP Nerdcast member or you need any accommodations for this course, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thanks so much for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.